So, good afternoon. We're here for 2 times in one day. Earlier today, we spoke with Colleen, who's doing our UFO hypnosis regression today and Sunday. And today this afternoon, we're talking with the woman who interviewed Betty and Barney Hill directly and has also some really first-hand experience with the incident at Exeter. So we're talking to Bonnie Meroth. Both. Meroth. It's coming. I'm fascinated by almost every story you have, so I haven't heard one yet that hasn't been fascinating, so go.
Okay, I probably first should say that a lot of people are mixed up about Betty and Barney's encounter with a UFO, which was in 1961 on September 19th, and with the incident in Exeter, which happened actually in 1965 on September 4. They confuse the two, and which are totally, well, I suppose they're separate incidences, but they're all UFOs, so they're certainly related. And until the incident at Exeter, not many people realized what had happened to Betty and Barney Hill because they didn't publicize it. There was an issue back then because they had an interracial marriage, and they didn't want to rock the boat any further than what was going on. So
they lived in Portsmouth.
They lived up north. They lived in Portsmouth, then Greenland. Betty moved to Greenland, and Barney worked for the post office in Portsmouth.
So they didn't put anything in the paper?
They did not. In fact, they weren't hypnotized until later on. They just didn't really talk about it. Yeah. And ironically, where the people in Exeter in 1965 involved, the two directly policemen and probably the dispatcher, who happens to be the uncle of our son-in-law, ironically, many moons before he became our son-in-law. And, of course, the young man, Norman Muscarello, who was in his late teens and had just joined the Navy. He was a Navy recruit. They were totally traumatized. And Barney was kind of took it head on, he said, but Betty almost welcomed it because they were heading back from Canada. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story that much, but they were heading back from Canada, and their plans changed. They headed home earlier because a hurricane was due, because it's hurricane season in New Hampshire in September. So they headed back early and came down a different route, and they were coming down. The roads have changed since 1961. It was Route 3 at the time, right? And they were heading down towards Lincoln and in that area, and Betty saw a bright star. And she thought, oh, that's a new star, something different, and she was focusing on it. And then the encounter began, actually before they were taken aboard quite a while.
So it was tracking.
They were coming down through Franconia Notch, where the old man in the mountain is.
Yeah.
They saw the UFO. Betty said they saw the UFO kind of hovering near the old man in the mountain, who was still there. Yeah. And he's no longer there, of course. And then they passed Indian Head Resort. They were near Indian Head Resort. There were some cabins. They saw a man coming out of a cabin who was just going in and out. And Betty was waving, basically, to them. Probably something I wouldn't have done.
Yeah, and then it was far. Like Ashland is where it happened much further south.
Well, the road sign, ironically... what was I can't remember, the 224, I think, is the name of the New Hampshire, the historical markers in New Hampshire. There's one for Betty and Barney's encounter. And that's in North Lincoln. So it's kind of, right there. And it happened, it came down near them in different areas that approached them. And then finally Barney was like, he wasn't going to take anymore, and he drove off Route 3 over a bridge onto a dirt road. And years later on, they tried to go back and find it, because in their mind's eye, couldn't quite remember it. And under hypnosis, they described it later on. And so it happened, and they lost 2 hours, during which they swear, and it cannot be disproved, that they were taken aboard the UFO. And she described, and in her book, she described them, she always called them astronauts, and it was the leader, the director, the note taker. I mean, she assigned them different names or occupations, and they kind of had a crushed in face, but much like, I don't know how do you picture an alien?
Looks like big
Big eyes.
Sort of a smaller chin, triangular
maybe
face.
an oval type head or whatnot, and it was kind of like that, but the face was pushed in a little bit, and different people have seen different things. Betty's relatives, it's very interesting to know that UFO encounters allegedly are in the same family.
Yeah.
So Betty's a relative of Betty has recounted that he has seen aliens. I'm going to call them alien. I hate to use that word because it has a total different meaning nowadays. I don't know what. ETs. Okay, ETs. Extra. Yeah, ETs. I love that movie. Did you see it? I love that movie.
I think you were born yet.
I've seen it when I was.
Are you too little? Do you know that?
I'm old enough.
Okay. ET phone home. But that's what, basically, that's kind of what they look like, according to what Betty had described.
And she had said that even years later that she would see them in Kingston along the...
She saw them her whole life.
Yeah.
Her whole life, and so did, her family. They would just, and that nobody talks about it.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about it. And again, it was, 4 years later before it came out. And the only reason it came out was because we had the incident at Exeter, and somebody leaked it to the Boston Traveler, I think it was called at that time, one of the newspapers down there, that they had this encounter. And so that's when everything hit the fan.
And they were just trying to keep...
They were just being low profile about the whole thing.
They had no interest in being a spectacle.
No, they weren't. Plus, who would believe them?
Right.
And so that's when the government... Well, they reported it anyway. When it happened, they reported it to the police, and they entered it into Project Blue Book.
Yeah.
Are you familiar?
I am.
Okay.
No, yeah. Get ready. This weekend will be all about Project Blue Book.
Project Blue Book. And that's the government's version.
And it's since declassified.
Yes.
There's somebody he'll be here in the next couple of days, Peter Robbins, who's read all that. It's during the Cold War era, maybe a little bit before, documenting lots of sightings, and you could probably say more than.
Well, they just have to document them as they were when it, basically they were proved, or this could not be disproved. What Betty and Barney's episode was, and again they kept it quiet until incident at Exeter, and even now, I'm talking to people maybe in their 30s who don't know what, and they live in the area and they don't know incident at Exeter, which is kind of sad, because Betty, right up until her death, believed they're around us. Whether people see them, some people, maybe it's like spirits. Some people see spirits and some people don't. Some people see ETs, and
I've heard his the medical hypnosis for him is on YouTube, and it really sounds like a very logical, rational man who's really not interested in seeing this. And a couple of times in the hypnosis, he just freaks out. It sounds like a guy who's trying to hold it together. Who's and he's saying as he's hypnotized, please be a jet.
Right.
Please make a sound. Please just be normal. I don't want. And then the hypnotist has to keep bringing him back to it's safe, it's okay. And it sounded like his death was sort of, there was a lot of stress in his life after the, it doesn't sound like he had peace from it, or it sounded like she sort of celebrated
She did. She celebrated it certainly more than he, and he died of a stroke quite young.
Yeah.
And who's to say?
Right, because I've heard people say, well, the whole thing was the stress of being an interracial couple. It's well, that's a lot. valid, but it was there's too many details. Like the car had some magnetic properties that it didn't have before.
Well, her
The dress
dress.
was
Now,
missing,
I saw her dress. It was a blue dress, and it had pink spots on it. And nobody to this day, no scientists, can identify what the substance is on her dress.
Wow.
And I think it's at UNH. It was on display at UNH at the time. I'm not sure where it is now. And another thing, in subsequent years, she traveled all over. She traveled all over the world. Her book, and I think Incident at Exeter too, was published in many languages and and John Fuller had written Incident at Exeter. And she met a woman who had a very similar experience. And this other woman, ironically, was wearing a blue dress and had the same holes in the same spot, tiny little holes in the same pattern as Betty had on her dress. So there's something with that. And Betty's dress was torn too. So, and they had gone, later on the medical people said that there's no way that Betty would have survived had, these are Western medical people, I will say, experts, in the medical field and in various areas, but they said nobody could survive what they did to her going through her navel to check things out or whatever they were doing. And they didn't do that to Barney.
They took his dentures out and tried to take her. They reached for hers.
Yeah. It's
no,
like they were just fascinated with us, in general. With
So what was her take on this? That it was a visit. It was an experiment. What was?
Oh, she was, she was taken aboard, and it was an encounter. Later on they referred to it as encounter, and this was before what was encounters of the
Close encounters,
of the first kind, and all the movies that came out afterwards.
Yeah. So what did you make of it at the time?
There was one factor that threw me right over the edge. Like, yeah, this happened, and that was that she actually pointed out under hypnosis, or a scientist showed her a chart. I can't remember exactly which now, but she pointed out two stars. One was alpha something, and the other I can't remember. And the scientist said there were no stars, but she was interrogating them, the ETs, and said that they were from these particular stars. Well, a few years later, those stars were discovered. So she nailed them through the ETs before they were actually discovered by our astronomers on Earth. So that was like, yeah.
Wow. And then the incident at Exeter, you guys mentioned you and your husband both in high school, you'd be able to see.
Yes. Now, in 1965, New England, New Hampshire was visited by, we always thought, well, maybe it's the radon up here or something that's attracted them. And because we had a lot of UFO sightings. And some people were, and some people were interested. So my husband and I, I think I was 17, he was a little older. And the recreation or the time to do, we were sincere about it, but we would take binoculars and go up to the highest peak around. And at that time I lived in Rochester, and my mom went with us, and we would go to the top of Rochester Hill and look for UFOs. Wow. And basically that's what they do now, and they see them out west all the time in Arizona and Montana, and they do that now. And I won't say it's a sport, but it's certainly an activity that can be fruitful. And again, now with all today's equipment and the fancy phones, and they record these things, and they can't disprove what they were, and they check them out later on to see if they were weather balloons, which seems to be the government's go-to. Not speaking disparagingly of the government. And so we were at the top of Rochester Hill, and this was the night of September 3rd, 1965. And we were looking all around, and there were many people from Rochester because that was the thing to do.
Before the incident,
It was the night of the incident at Exeter, because the incident now Betty and Barney's took place on September 19th and 20th on 1961. And the reason is because it started before midnight. Yeah. They were probably encountered at 2 a.m. ish, and then lost a couple of hours. And I won't say lost because I think those hours were quite significant later on, certainly to them and to the world. That's what the marker says on the historical marker. Basically said it was the first UFO encountered that went multi everywhere. It was basically all over the United States and the world. And but we're at the top of the hill and we're looking towards Exeter and Hampton because and Seabrook, where a lot of high power lines are, because they were known that UFOs. He had this little profile about UFOs that we went by, and one was that they like swamps and they went to power lines. And since in recent years, I've learned that they like to visit the same family and the progeny of Betty Hill. You know, has been they've been visited. So which is I find fascinating because evidently ETs are into DNA. And but we saw flashing red lights, and we thought, oh, it's Pease, because you had Pease Air Force Base in that area, and from the top of Rochester Hill it's kind of all grouped together, you know, towards the seacoast, and we didn't think too much of it. And it was good that we had heard about it. I can't remember if it was the next day or perhaps a few days later, because evidently somebody from Pease Air Force Base went around the next day and picked up all, because the press got a hold of it, and they picked up all the newspapers off the newsstands that with any mention of the story. So to me, that's
there were
like
just no newspapers to buy.
No, they picked all of the media reports or whatever. That was one way to hush them back then. Now they wouldn't have a chance.
So what was the local buzz when that happened? Like when you couldn't buy a paper, were people like, oh?
I don't think anybody said, and you know, it wasn't really at that time. It was like a little bit later on. It was like, oh, you know, maybe that's what we saw because it was around the same time. It had to be what they saw. And of course, the actual incident focused around poor Norman Muscarello, who was the Navy recruit. He was in his late teens, and he was hitchhiking from Amesbury to Exeter. And this thing was following him with the bright red pulsating lights, and then he was engulfed. I mean, just close your eyes and picture this. He was engulfed in the blackness of a late summer night, and that's what surrounded him. And suddenly, this thing looms at him. And the pulsing lights, he saw the silvery, it wobbled, it tilted. He was petrified. He threw himself against a stone wall and just basically huddled there. Eventually it moved away. He tried to bang on someone's door, ran to bang on someone's door. Finally an older couple, I think, found him and took him to the police station, where Scratch Tolan, who was the dispatcher, took one look at his face and knew this guy wasn't pretending. I mean, he had no color, absolutely no color in his face. And so he dispatched Officer Bertrand back to the scene where Norman Muscarello had seen the UFO. And ironically, now there shouldn't have been a little thing go off in Bertrand's mind, because a little earlier that evening, he had, I think around midnight, maybe, it was that a woman had traveled from Epping, where I live, to Exeter, and I thought of that on the drive from Epping to Exeter this morning.
12 miles.
Coming here, 12 miles, and she was a couple of miles outside of Exeter, and she was pulled over to the side of the road, and she had related the same thing, that this object, silvery, wobbly, tilty, red lights, pulsating, had followed her. And so he sent her on her way and calmed her down. And then here he is dispatched by
And then there were
Scratch
farm animals
Toland.
going crazy at
Oh.
people's farm.
Well, yeah. So Officer Bertrand went back to the scene with Norman. I'm going to call him Norman Muscarello. They always refer to him as Muscarello. With the teen. Okay, he went back to the scene with the teen, and who probably wasn't very sophisticated about these things or knowledgeable, even though people had talked about them and were looking for them and that sort of thing. And they sat in the cruiser and they waited, and there was nothing. And so he went on the radio and went back to Dispatcher Toland, and he said, "Well, I don't see anything. There's nothing here." And so Dispatcher Toland said, "Well, I want you to get out of the car and walk around." Now, my husband, the policeman, I'm not sure he'd be wanting to do that. I should have asked him, would that be something you'd want to do? And, of course, the teenager was scared to death, poor Norman. And so they did. They started towards the area where Norman had seen the object go. And all of a sudden, whoosh, it comes up from behind the trees. And it just looms. And there it is, this tilty, wobbly, pulsating object in the sky. And it headed right for him. So Norman's screaming, watch out, here it comes," or something like that. And Bertrand, no, Scratch is the dispatcher. So Bertrand, at that time, was worried about, which was kind of smart, he was worried about radioactive stuff. And he grabbed the teenager to pull him to safety, and muscle reaction, what cops do, he got on his knees and pulled his service weapon. He never fired it, but, and later on, Norman said that he kept saying, I'll shoot it. I mean, there has to be a little hysteria going on, regardless. And so then he was able to dispatch that to Scratch Toland, who was at the police station, and Scratch he was able to radio it, and so the dispatcher sent another officer, Hunt, out to the scene, and the object was still there. Wow. And so you have two police officers, sane, of sound mind, and this teenager who witnessed this, which is a strong, strong evidence that it happened. It happened. And later on, the teenager's mother was interviewed. I'm sure that they wanted to know if the teen had any previous issues, probably. And she saw the report that this person from Pease, or the Air Force, had written down, and he referred to it as the site, the landing site. That's what was written. And ironically, this notebook was handcuffed to him. Oh, wow. So whatever notes he had in there during all these interviews, it was handcuffed to this particular person. And when they went out to investigate later, they didn't wear their uniforms. They were dressed in plain clothes. So I in all fairness, it's like, why do you want to scare the public? Yeah. I'm sure there were people who would find it very unnerving. And I was young at that time. I probably just maybe too young to find it unnerving. I just would have been fascinated, like, oh boy. Yeah. And I think that movie E.T. helped people with their fear of UFOs, perhaps. But the family of Betty Hill, like I say, the progeny who wake up at night and see ETs at the foot of their bed, they just live with it.
And do they live around here?
They do.
They do. Are some coming to the event?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Neat.
Yes.
Wow.
Yep. Yep. So, and then Betty went on even after Barney's death, and they gave lectures and spoke. And Barney, I remember in Rochester at the Catholic Church, he had given a seminar, a lecture on civil rights. Yeah. So and of course after 1965 they really became much more well known. And I had the pleasure of doing the 25th anniversary story in local newspapers when they came, the 25th anniversary of incident at Exeter, and Betty was there, and they kind of combined the whole thing, and they had to turn away hundreds of people at the Exeter Library because people again, I think it's the fascination, and you don't want to admit. Like, yeah, I think I believe, but
yeah, there's a lot of that. Right?
Still, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to believe in ghosts, but I'm fascinated.
Almost an unhealthy skepticism, like a
well,
nothing. Like
there's healthy there's healthy and there's unhealthy. I think So and there are those, hey, until I witness it, I'm not going to believe. But how can you not believe these people who are an intrinsic part of the whole experience, and who went and who underwent hypnotism? By being hypnotized, I don't think you can fudge any of that.
And even if you could, the police officers who were just
the police officers
busy
backed
doing
it
other
up.
things.
Then you've got the woman who drove from
Epping.
to Exeter. She experienced it, so it happened before. And then simultaneously, now while, and I think it was right when Bertrand and Hunt were finishing up there, because the thing took off and it headed towards Hampton. And then a lot of power lines and whatever in Hampton. But simultaneously, the Hampton Police Department received a call from someone from a phone booth who was frantically telling them the same story about this poor woman from Exeter. And he just hung up. So whether he hung up because he was afraid it was going to get him, or he hung up because he didn't want anybody to know he was seeing these things. So,
Yeah. Well, I'm just beyond curious, and I grew up in New Hampshire, so as well, you meet people, police officer, or old lady over there, people who've seen stuff on their land, or got called out to something. So it is. I think we exchanged a few stories the other day, but it's neat to talk to somebody who's who's really had such firsthand experience with such a.
And I I'm a pretty good reader of people. I can almost sense, I can see the auras and sense kind of what they're about or whatever. And I was immediately taken with Betty.
As genuine.
As absolutely genuine.
Yeah.
So and a nice lady. So,
Good.
But like I say, I think now, in retrospect, remembering what Betty said, that she wasn't even sure whether they show themselves to some people and don't show themselves to other people, like a spirit.
Yeah.
Or some people have the ability. I know my psychic medium friend Debbie often says that we all have the ability to see spirits or feel them or know that they're around us and communicate with them. We just don't promulgate it because.
Yeah. Well, this is the weekend for the because.
It
opposite
is.
Of the because. So,
it is, and there'll be lots of fun things. We've tried to go to. I don't know how many years they've done this. At least 3.
Yeah, I think hasn't been too many. Right?
No, it started really, and I'm glad because, and there are some fun things like there are in Roswell, Georgia. We all know Roswell, Georgia, where allegedly an actual you know Roswell?
New Mexico.
New Mexico. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have a friend
There
in
is
Roswell, Georgia.
Yeah.
Whoops. In Roswell, New Mexico, and they actually have allegedly the body
site.
that crash site, and they have the quote weather balloon end quote that the government chalked it up to, and they have the body of a little ET.
Yeah.
And I've not seen pictures of the actual body of the little ET, but I've seen they have a museum out there where they've done a little wax museum or something of all the government people standing over this little ET. And it kind of looked like E.T. falling home.
Maybe next year we'll get the body here on display
know.
as the attraction.
That would be cool. So anyway, so how do you guys feel? Do you believe?
Well, we have Jennifer here who is totally dropped in from the sky, so it would be interesting to hear how.
Yeah, and so for myself, I started hearing about the incident and about the Betty and Benny Hill, just from seeing, ads and people's posters up on the windows, walking along the sidewalks of town here in Exeter. And that's when I started getting intrigued. I'm like, what's going on with this UFO festival? What is this about? And so that's when I read online. And I mean, of course, I'm not sure which is the best source of truth. What's the real source of truth? And so I'm glad that, I'm able to hear this firsthand from you directly. And one of the articles that I did read online, I think they said, hey, we've solved the whole Exeter incident, and they claimed that it was an airline refueler.
Force, yeah.
Because they talked about the blinking lights and how it's at a 65-degree angle, that sort of thing. And they just tried to make it a wrap, and they said, okay, that's it. That's what it is.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so that's one of the latest articles. There's a whole bunch of theories with what it was exactly, but that's what they claim is like one of the main what it was.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know.
An important thing I left out was that there was no sound.
Yeah.
So wouldn't a refueler make noise?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's a jet, right?
And
And it's on the ground. And there were marks on the ground. And the government told the local farmer, erase those marks with your plow.
Right.
So...
Yeah, just from everything, it sounds like the government's just been trying to cover up a lot of things, which kind of just, indicates something.
Yeah.
Well, our new generations must have mellowed, or they think it's an old enough story, because aren't they starting to release things now?
Yeah. So there's
Release about
many things are declassified. So there is, and even the letters between the Air Force and the police department were never classified, I don't think. And in the end, the Air Force apologized because they were saying that it's initially said it was Pease Air Force Base lights, and so they did a presentation to some townspeople. They turned on the lights and nothing happened, so everyone laughed and away they went. But it was back and forth. The police department didn't back down. They kept saying there was a sighting here. The weapons were drawn because there was something actually real. The Air Force, they went back and forth until finally the Air Force sent an apology that, and I guess the UFO unidentified thing was given, and you could say Cold War time. Maybe it was a cover-up, but for me, the animals were the interesting things. You mentioned about somebody's chickens never...
Someone's chickens stopped laying eggs.
Like forever. It didn't...
Oh, what's the chicken know?
Right.
Like, the sun's coming up early.
Which came first, the saucer or the egg?
Yes, right. And then the horses were, one of the things that they did report was that the horses started whinnying, the dogs were howling, and not, a dog can bark, but these dogs were like howling in distress. It was a different kind of noise or whatnot. So I also think it's interesting that people with security clearances in the government are allowed to know certain things, and I don't think they're still, and like the president or the higher ups can know certain things.
Right, Area 51.
But we're not, but they still haven't been released or something. Yeah. So, and every president, it's like every time it's like, okay, this is the term when everything's going to be released.
Right.
So is everything released?
Well, have you heard the Canadian former defense minister
in
Canada? Oh, I'll give you the name afterwards. That's really worthwhile. There was a former Canadian defense minister who has an incredible amount to say because he was privy to some of the U.S. stuff. But it's like, you definitely want to hear him. I forget his name, but
in Canada, all over the world, people have experienced UFOs. Yeah. In the 12th century, it was chronicled over an abbey.
Yeah, with this little blue man or something with
but it was like a house floating, a silver object, shiny, bright, terrifying. I mean, that's in the 1100s.
Yeah.
So, and most of these will see windows. Yeah. So some of them have said it's tantamount to like a floating building because they see the windows, but there's no noise.
Yeah.
So.
Well, more to come. Come down to the cave. We have a couple of events for the weekend, and then there's a bunch of things happening next door at Old Town Hall. So, Bonnie, thank you so much for today. Jennifer, thank you for bearing witness and being our audience of one. And
Thanks for allowing me to be here too.
Thanks, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Darrell.